So, hello, Shannon. Nice to have you here and to talk about many things. But one of the things we're going to focus our attention on today is the issue of gender in research and in organizations, specifically policy research organizations, which is what on think tanks focuses their attention on. But Shannon, why don't you tell us a little bit about your own work in general and in this field?
Sure. Hi, Kike. Nice to be here. So I'm currently working as an independent consultant. And in this work, I'm connecting with organizations who are really exploring this question of gender equality at an organizational level, but also in the research, in the work they're doing, and asking questions like, how do we walk the talk? What does it mean to really support our partners in the work they're doing, but also be thinking and reflecting on what we as an organization can be doing differently, can be doing better. So I've had recent projects with a group called Gender at Work. And when we work with organizations, we typically engage them in these long, reflective, thoughtful processes where they identify the change that they're seeking, and then through peer learning processes, work towards enacting that change. And I think what's really key about that kind of work is that this type of change can be slow and does take time for it to be really done well. Because in other elements of my work, I'm working with groups who are saying, okay, we have 6 months, we're putting out this big call. What can we do to really integrate gender considerations in the work they're doing? What are some, like, not necessarily easy wins, but what would a checklist of key considerations look like? And I think while tools can have their limitations and there's no silver bullet, like follow this A to Z list and gender equality will magically be achieved, at the same time, there are opportunities to really be, especially for donors and funders, to be saying to their partners, here are questions that we're asking ourselves. Let's see them built into your call for proposals. Let's see them in your communications plans, your monitoring and evaluation processes, and let's see them in the engagement you're undertaking once your results and findings are available. And so there are some key questions that I think we can be raising with all of these different, whether it's a project, an organization, or even an individual researcher. But what I notice across all of the projects I'm involved in with Oxfam Canada, of course, with think tanks, working with think tanks, and working with the International Development Research Center, is the importance of not defining that for partners and not saying, here's our idea of gender equality. Let's see it implemented this way, and really letting partners decide what that looks like for them.
But so a couple of questions. What are those key questions? Can you give us some examples of the key questions that funders are asking themselves and asking their grantees or partners to ask themselves? And the second question, I guess, behind those questions, there are some ideas, some ideals of what that looks like, what the answer is. Even if you don't want to impose it on your grantees, there's probably a kind of a benchmark or a minimum level that funders are expecting their grantees to reach. But what are those key questions?
Right. Okay. So I think what I'll do is I'll share some ideas of key questions, both for thinking about gender equality in research and at an organizational level. And then I can share a few lessons that I've learned about what really needs to change for this work to be meaningful and impactful and last longer term. Okay, so thinking about the research, I think in terms of gender analysis, and of course, even just the term gender analysis can be interpreted in many different ways. And often just defining those key terms and definitions early on is so key, whether it's in a request for proposals that's going out, it's in a project report. We just need to always be clear what we're talking about when we're using these terms. But a question we often put to partners is, tell us what you're doing in terms of gender analysis. So it's not saying, here's what it should look like at each stage of the project life cycle, but tell us what this looks like for you. And I think what we always need to be stressing is it's not just about saying, oh, and we'll also look at the women and marginalized groups when we're doing X, and we'll look at them again when we're doing Y. So really building in questions like, who's on your research team and what roles are they in? who are you talking to when you're out in the field doing your research? What are the questions that are being asked? And really understanding the gendered nature of many of those questions. The findings and how they're being shared. So who's presenting them, who's in the room, and who gets to be part of the conversations that are happening with policymakers or with civil society. And actually on that latter point, I think we've seen some really exciting work come out of a group in Latin America, Grupo Sofia, of think tanks and universities, where they've done really interesting work on gender equitable conferences and events. And I think this is one area where a checklist can be extremely valuable, because we can say, who did you invite? Who's on your panel? Who are you going to when you're asking certain questions? Who's going to be promoted in your materials? And so I think that's, there are some areas where we can have these key lists of questions that can be asked. With the broader research in general, I think often the relationship between a program officer and a research partner is key. So I think we tend to expect program officers to be able to do everything, to be a complete master of all trades, but really program officers are constantly learning from their partners about what their capacity is, what their needs are, the challenges they're facing. And for those program officers and research partners to be able to work together over time to address challenges that come up. So it might be that there's a great gender analysis done at the beginning, and throughout all stages of the project life cycle, from initiation through implementation and sharing of findings, there is a strong gender analysis being built in. But of course, we know that gender fade is something that can happen in projects. And that's where groups start out with great intentions, but for many reasons, competing interests, changing priorities, that gender focus really gets lost. And a big reason that often happens is that even if there's a gender focal point or a gender champion within the team, they don't always have the resources they need in terms of finances and time. So I think if we go back to this question of what donors and funders can do, what program officers can do to really ensure that these gender considerations are embedded in the research, it's helping teams also find a way to support those gender champions, to ensure that they have the space they need to really be prioritizing this in the research.
But this takes me to the other side, questions about the other side of your discussion, which is about the organization itself, right? Because to some extent, projects are like the facade, right? So that's what the organization presents to funders. That's what the organization delivers. So it is possible to, have a team with a gender specialist to perform gender, do the gender analysis, to present it in the right way to the right audiences, the right channels, making sure you've got a panel that is diverse, etc. All those checklists that you can do, but you can do this by running an organization does not provide the basic support to the women within the organization. That is not in itself an open or inclusive organization, because its business model just doesn't allow it, right? So what are the kind of questions that funders can ask, or ask grantees to ask themselves about gender in the organization? Which I think if that's happening, if that's incorporated, then projects will run naturally, with this sort of gender lens, or incorporating gender into.
Yeah, I think it's such an important question, because there's also, we hear about organizations doing important work on advocating for women's rights, or work that we would squarely put in the gender equality space, whether it's on gender-based violence, maternal health. Doesn't mean that the organizations themselves are not perpetuating gender inequality. And I think that this question is really about how organizations walk the talk. So think tanks, organizations more generally, we know that they are gendered spaces. So there's an opportunity to be fostering gender equality. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means, or to be perpetuating those inequalities. And here I'll also say that when we talk about gender, we do tend to talk about women quite a bit, but I think we need to be talking about men, women, gender diverse individuals, and always thinking about intersectionality. So those multiple identities that intersect, identities around race, class, ethnicity, age, to name a few. And so organizations today, I think, are really asking these questions in a much more nuanced way, and understanding that diverse organizations are spaces that can really do higher quality work and have more of an impact, and seeing the importance of ensuring their staff represent kind of those goals they're working towards as well. So in terms of the organizations themselves, there are all kinds of questions across the board that can be asked in terms of, do you have a gender policy or a non-discrimination policy? HR is a big area where we can be thinking about this. So what does recruitment look like? What's written in job descriptions, and what type of experience is being sought? Does it take into consideration the fact that people need to have gaps in their CVs, often for parental responsibilities? And are we penalizing people, particularly women, because of that? Retention as well. And then thinking about promotion. So prior to working as a consultant, I was with the International Development Research Center, the think tank initiative project there, for just under 7 years, and did quite a bit of work on gender equality there. And we looked at the think tanks we were working at and saw that there was a fairly good representation of women within the think tanks, but not at the senior levels. So it changed as soon as you moved from the gendered roles or the junior roles to the more senior roles. So why is that happening? And if we think about promotion and who's getting into those senior leadership and management positions, there's all kinds of exciting literature out there around what that looks like. So whether it's mentorship, now there's even some exciting work being done around reverse mentorship. So more junior staff being able to mentor staff who are further along in their careers, particularly around, I would say, diversity, equality, and inclusion, where a lot of this is a field that we're really learning so much about in real time right now. Communications. So within the think tank initiative, we saw that communications for research was absolutely key in terms of achieving policy impact and really being part of the evidence-informed policymaking space. But communications is also a place where there are all kinds of opportunities to effectively integrate gender or get it wrong. And in one of my projects, we've been looking at what decolonizing communications and bringing in gender equitable and inclusive communications to projects looks like. And this runs the gamut from thinking about images and who's depicted and what roles they're in, to the language we use. And language can be tricky. We always have to think, okay, how is this term like feminism going to land in some countries in Latin America where this is a term that might not be viewed as a favorable one that donors can get behind? How can we talk about the importance of LGBTQ2+ rights in countries where homosexuality is illegal? So often we have to, with our communications, be thinking carefully about how we're finding ways to bring these ideas to audiences in a really nuanced way that lets us talk about these challenges, but also in a way that lets us demonstrate that we are thinking about these gender considerations from the time the project or the program is developed to when the findings are shared.
So not just about, I mean, I keep saying there's not just about the what. So, yes, you do great research, but how are you doing it? Yes, you're having impact, but how are you having impact? And I think sometimes policy research organizations, sometimes pressured by funders, or maybe they feel they're pressured by their funders, are trying to achieve change really fast. They're trying to achieve many changes within the organization. There might be many programs running at the same time, and they're more concerned about achieving change, within the current rules of the game, right? Maybe in a very unequal, exclusive policy space. And so let's play the game, right? Let's not try to challenge it. Let's not try to be more inclusive of new voices, of new faces, of new backgrounds, of new languages, new narratives. Let's just do what works to bring about change. And what you're saying is that the kind of questions funders are asking their grantees to ask themselves, in a way, should make them think about how much they're doing and how they're doing it, and not worry so much about, as I said, quality of the research, publishable material, and or achieving change by any means. But the question is about how you're doing it. Are you doing it in a way, right, that is reinforcing the gender biases, or are you doing it in a way that's challenging those gender biases?
Yeah, and I would also say that it is all interlinked, of course. So if we're looking at gender equitable research, we have all kinds of evidence that is going to lead to higher quality research. And the RQ Plus model at the International Development
IRC,
Research
yes.
Center that both you and I are familiar with, Kike, gender equality, gender considerations do factor. So I think we can't think about one without thinking about the other. We need to be thinking about how we're doing it. Fortunately, we're no longer asking the why question. I think quite a bit of progress has been made, and organizations are now saying, we know we need to do it. We just need to figure out how best to do it. And there is a social justice argument.
Sorry, keep going.
I was just going to say there's a social justice argument. Yes, women should have equal opportunities to men. I think we can all get behind that. But there's also this, like, because it makes for higher quality research, because it makes for more diverse organizations. And we saw in this article that Ruth Levine wrote about connecting with policymakers, we see that organizations that have women in them might be better suited to having some of those conversations and really achieving policy impact. So we can also always talk about that. For what purpose? Well, here's the evidence on why this will also lead to more of an impact.
Right. Okay. No, I to be honest, I have the feeling that there's no challenging of the why, right? The purpose is that this is going to lead to better evidence. Mm. Where I feel is there is still some challenging, and maybe you have a different impression, is that what think tanks might say is, well, okay, but this, things are hard already, right? And now we have to make some changes within the organization. You talked about HR, you've talked about the ways in which we communicate. Most think tanks do not have, a communication team large enough to handle one or two projects at the same time. And now they have to think about how they communicate, what language they use, words they use, what narratives they are supporting or challenging, how to hire, how to retain opportunities. I mean, these are big investments. Some think tanks, I think, are lucky to receive the funding, especially unrestricted funding that allows them to invest in these things. But most, the reality, especially in the global South, most live by the day, right? Project funding is not enough to cover their overheads. And, I think most of them are trying to do good. But what, besides giving them more funding, are there any things that funders could do to help, especially those organizations that are smaller, that maybe are working in an environment that is not necessarily the most inclusive and most open to some of these ideas, that is not that interested yet in the value of having a plural workforce, women in leadership positions, women as the messengers of the arguments, etc. Are there any things that funders can do to support those organizations, resource strapped and in an environment that is not necessarily pushing them in that direction or is conducive of those reforms?
Yeah, that's right, because we haven't really gotten into talking about context, but the context will also have a huge impact on what organizations are able to do. This is where I think, obviously what we're talking about here, what would it look like to do great gender equitable research or really embedded organizationally? These are ideals. These are, wouldn't it be nice to see this? We have to always be thinking about organizational readiness and about meeting organizations where they're at. And also, as someone who worked at a Northern funding agency, not going in and saying, this is how you should do it. And donors, I think, also have to be careful not to put pressure on partners to add this to the long list of, competing priorities they already have. So I think this is where I have really seen the power of action learning processes work. And I'll tell you a little bit about an experience I had with the Think Tank Initiative. By that point, I think we were about 7 years into a 10-year program with the Think Tank Initiative. Many think tanks had already been embedding really exciting feminist methodologies or gender considerations in their research, or doing interesting work on promoting women in the social sciences. So we had all these great examples from across the 43 think tanks we were promoting at that time, or sorry, that we were supporting at that time. But we realized that we needed to find a way to provide some more support and continue to build that capacity and really think about our own role and what we could do a bit differently. And so instead of coming out with a project where we said, we now expect all of you to really be working on gender, and here's what it looks like, we created an action learning project with Gender at Work, where we allowed think tanks to opt in and define what success meant for them. And so 5 think tanks participated, all kinds of different projects. Some developed an organizational-wide gender policy. Others worked on promoting women researchers in their countries. And then others came up with a project lifecycle gender analysis that they could implement in future projects. And we weren't sure how they would all come together in a peer learning environment, but they really, really connected and learned from each other, to the point that we brought them together twice. And the final time was at a write shop in Guatemala, where we had everyone blog about their reflections and what they were learning. And I learned a great deal through supporting that project as the program officer, because what I saw is that they were all dealing with different contexts, different realities, different organizational identities. So if we were to come up with a list of what works well in organizations from this group of 5, some of whom were very small, and as you say, wouldn't have the resources or capacity to really be rethinking how they do all of their communications or all of their HR processes, what seemed to work was always having a gender champion or a gender focal point, somebody who was really engaged and passionate and could keep it on the agenda so it didn't fade away. Second was having senior management buy-in. So for this gender action learning project, we had changed teams, and the executive director had to be on each team. They all wanted to be, which was great, but we felt it was essential to really have that higher level engagement, because for this type of change to happen, whether it means bringing it into future research agendas or bringing it into all aspects of the organization, it needs to involve the engagement of people at those senior levels, right? In some cases, embedding gender in the research, in some cases, thinking more carefully about where there could be change within the organization. But also, sound familiar, is the importance of engaging men and not just women, because in many projects, we're actually talking about issues like toxic masculinities or gang violence, where we need to be really understanding the role that men and women take on in these situations. And so just constantly reminding ourselves, we're not just talking about the women. And something else I want to say there is, in this project, I won't get into the details, but we used a framework that allowed us to really look at power relations and social norms, because I think to be able to do this work well, we have to always understand the barriers that exist in organizations and in the broader context, in the ecosystem. And we have to make sure we don't fall into this pattern. If, say we're thinking about women in leadership positions, in the past, I think we tended to speak more about confidence building and soft skills, and that can still be important. But if we're not thinking about how the structures are changing, who's getting access to mentoring opportunities, who's getting a role on the board, and really asking those key questions and trying to change those systems, then the opportunities won't be there. So really taking that whole systems approach.
Yes, those are changes without real changes, because you're not changing the balance of power. You're just saying to women, you have to speak up, you have to dress differently, right? You have to lean in. But actually, the men or those who are sitting at the table don't have to move anywhere, that they can stay in their place. But I think what you're describing fits quite nicely with this idea of asking questions, because it's through this learning process that you get to ask questions and answer them, not once, but a few times along the journey, right? Maybe with the information you have now, later on with the information you gain from looking inside the organization, later on with the information you gain from working with others, with peers that are going through similar journeys or different journeys. And I guess it's like exercising our ethical muscle, right? We need to ask ourselves questions along the way. You're never going to get that perfect organization, but um, I think it might be that the objective we're aiming at is an organization that is reflective about its situation and is constantly thinking, you know, is this the best we can do? Is this the right thing of doing things? What are the consequences of how we govern, how we're managed, how we resource? What are the consequences of our business model? Can we do something about? I think acknowledging those things, maybe it's good enough, right? In the absence of this ideal, perfect organization that probably doesn't exist out there.
Yeah, that's right. And then I think also being able to find really simple ways for change to happen. So it's great to have an 18-month action learning process or an organizational wide review of policies, but sometimes we just need to find the low-hanging fruit and be able to take steps towards that larger change. So as a consultant, I'm also learning about the importance of experimenting with new tools and approaches. So in a couple of my projects, we've been working with a new approach that we're calling a conversation guide. And the idea is, okay, if we're going to go to a consultancy, a short-term process, say 6 months, but we want to really create some kind of impact or change that will last for a few years, how do we, I guess this is along the lines of train the trainer approaches, but how do we bring in tools, ideas that, say in this situation, program officers and research partners can use over time? And so instead of just saying to the program officer, here's a checklist, next time you write a request for proposal, make sure you ask all of these questions. I think that can be helpful, but what can you be asking your partner at year 1, year 2, and year 3, for however long the project goes on, to ensure things are still on track and adjust to the realities of how things change? And it also, I think, is about creating a space for partners to be able to say, here's what I need from you. This is the support that I might not be getting that I really need in this context. And I think if we can find a way to just create space for more of those conversations, easier said than done, I know, but if we can build in those moments, I think that there are opportunities to keep those agendas, keep those questions on the agenda over time. And so I'm constantly learning as a consultant about ways we might be able to do that and kind of fine tuning that and learning from others. But I think there are all kinds of great resources out there that organizations can use for this.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think, it's about creating those spaces and rhythms where people can come together and reflect on this in a continuous way, rather than just for the project or for the proposal. Thank you very much, Shannon, and I look forward to hearing more about your work in this space.